probably worked in your church and any Christian in the neighborhood.
I know you did Trinity, that's true, you did.
I did Trinity. I worked for Diane for over a year.
Did you work for her for a year?
For a year.
You were the guy with the stick and the line?
Diane?
Wasn't she tearing your posters down?
Crazy Christian woman.
We'll start this thing off. Just stand around so it looks like we got more of a crowd.
Nowadays I'm working out of St. Mark's.
Good. Where do you want?
Set up in the front left. Yeah. Come promotion time, they didn't even put his name on the list.
We don't need to. Okay. On this side.
A couple months ago. And then he just got mad at him and walked out. Didn't even go for like 2 minutes.
He was here.
On the steps, get a crowd. All right, Jerry. All right, we're going to start the press conference. The first statement we want to make is that if Mayor Bloomberg will allow us to put surveillance cameras in City Hall, at his townhouse on the Upper East Side, at Gracie Mansion, and especially at his little retreat down in the Bahamas, then we're willing to let him put surveillance cameras in Tompkins Square Park. As many of you might have been reading in the press recently, a lot of politicians are getting arrested for everything from hookers to Christine Quinn herself is now under investigation for some kind of shady slush fund that she set up. So we really believe that all the politicians need surveillance cameras in their offices. And when they use the example of combating crime to make an excuse for putting surveillance cameras everywhere, they ought to start in the politicians' offices, because it's clearly been demonstrated that all kinds of crime has been going on in politicians' offices all the way up to the governor of New York State. Also, we would like to say that we've been doing things down in Tompkins Square Park for years, for quite a long time. And for some reason, the Parks Department seems to feel like we don't have any right to do things in Tompkins Square Park. They make it extremely hard for us. But banking entities or other corporate events in Tompkins Square Park don't seem to have a problem getting permits for their events. We want to say that because this is the 20th anniversary of the Tompkins Square Park riots,
Police riots,
that we have a right to do something around that weekend in Tompkins Square Park, and we're going to fight the Parks Department to get the permits for that. We've already talked to some lawyers who contacted the Parks Department, and because it's that important to us, we're doing the press conference today because we feel the Parks Department should defer to us because we've been doing so many events for so many years in Tompkins Square Park. Another issue is the fact that the economy is getting so bad in this city, people will not be able to pay for entertainment the way they have been in the past. Therefore, Tompkins Square Park is going to be needed for free entertainment. Now, you might think it's easy to put on these shows. It's not easy. It costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of effort. You have to line up bands. You have to get permits. You have to put down cleanup bonds. You have to promote the shows. And therefore, the Parks Department should encourage people from the neighborhood to do these kind of events instead of making it extremely hard and forcing people to get lawyers and going to court to do these events. The next speaker will be Bill Weinberg, who's going to give a brief history of Tompkins Square Park. He's recently written a number of articles for things about Tompkins Square Park, including a book by a famous Japanese photographer, Kyu Sakamaki, which will be only photographs of Tompkins Square Park, and Bill wrote the introduction to the book.
New York City, and like America and the world, is rapidly changing. That's obvious. And for some of us old-timers who grew up in this town, there's inevitably going to be certain pangs of nostalgia. And there are certain battles which we sort of understand we aren't going to win. The MTA is not going to bring back tokens, and probably it's going to be a long time before the steps of City Hall are once again a free public commons as they were up until 9/11. And video cameras are proliferating all over the city. We can't really hold back the tide. But I'm here to argue the case today that Tompkins Square Park should remain a liberated zone from video cameras in the name of historical remembrance, if nothing else. Going back to the very beginnings of New York City, the very beginnings of Tompkins Square Park, it has been a liberated zone. It has been an area for social protest, and it has been an area for community control to a far greater degree than any other park in the city. The first Tompkins Square Park riot, if you will, was in the Depression of 1857 when the unemployed gathered in the park. Thousands of the unemployed gathered in the park to demand relief. The park was a center among several other centers in Lower Manhattan of the anti-draft riots during the Civil War. And in the immediate aftermath, in both these instances, the city came in and they destroyed the park and they rebuilt it from scratch according to a new design to try to keep everybody under control. The biggest riot in the park ever, everybody remembers 1988, but that was nothing compared to 1874. 1874, there was another big depression. Once again, the unemployed gathered in the park to demand relief. They were attacked by the police, and there was a huge bloody battle. One of the people who was hurt that day was Samuel Gompers, who went on to found the American Federation of Labor. 1877, in coordination with the national strike to demand an 8-hour workday, there was yet again big protest in the park. In the Second World War, the park was opened up to the community, broken up into garden plots so people could have their own gardens, grow their own food, part of the war effort. And the park was, once again, liberated zone for the people, with government encouragement, I might add. Then, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, there was the backlash. Robert Moses came in, the park was redesigned, became much more sterile. The next big riot after that was 1967, when a bunch of hippies and Puerto Ricans were strumming guitars and beating on bongo drums in the park, and they were attacked by the police. And finally, we had the big explosion of exactly 20 years ago this summer, 1988. And that was when that was sort of the climax of the big struggle over the Lower East Side, and part of really the big struggle over New York City generally, the beginning of the big cultural backlash, which we've seen everywhere, but especially in New York City, and especially in the Lower East Side since then. And the town has been cleaned up, the town is safer. People who are moving into the neighborhood today don't even remember that there ever was a Tompkins Square band shell where Richie Havens and the Grateful Dead and countless punk and salsa bands played over the years. They don't even remember that there was even a 1988 Tompkins Square riot, much less an 1857 Tompkins Square riot. So I'm here to argue. I'm not here to romanticize riots. I don't like violence. I really don't. But I am here to speak in favor of historical memory and maintaining at least one element of Tompkins Square Park as a liberated zone, which is it should be at least one island in this city which is free from ubiquitous government surveillance. Thank you very much.
I want to repeat the opening statements for our new press here. We're here on the 20th anniversary of the Tompkins Square Park riot to send a message to Mayor Bloomberg, and the message is, if he will allow us to put surveillance cameras here at his office down in City Hall, and he'll let us wire up his townhouse, Gracie Mansion, and especially his resort down in the Bahamas, then we'll be willing to let him put surveillance cameras in Tompkins Square Park. If he's not willing to do that, then we don't want surveillance cameras in Tompkins Square Park. And I also want to add that because of recent news reports of rampant crime among politicians in the state of New York, including the governor, now Christine Quinn is under investigation for some kind of a slush fund she was running. I mean, any of you that have been reading the press recently, you know that there's a lot of crime in politicians' offices here in New York State. We want them all wired up with video cameras. That if they want to use crime as a justification for putting video cameras everywhere in this city, we ought to start with putting video cameras in every politician's office in the city and the state of New York, because I think that would be a good way to start combating crime first, and then we'll move along to putting cameras in the rest of the city. Also, we'd like to state that the New York City Parks Department has been giving us a hard time every year when we try to get permits to do events in Tompkins Square Park. When corporate entities like banks or restaurants or other entities like that want to do events in Tompkins Square Park, they have no problem getting permits. We do. And we feel that because we've been long-standing community members, we participated in struggles over gardens, housing, homelessness, we run food programs and all kinds of things for the community, that we ought to get first priority when it comes to getting permits in Tompkins Square Park, and not EAB or Citibank or big restaurants or the rich yuppies that have moved into and taken over our neighborhood.
What a Christian.
And we will be, regardless of whether or not we get a permit in Tompkins Square Park on the anniversary of the riot, to once again commemorate it and point out the history of resistance by our neighborhood, the Lower East Side, to unjust political practices, homelessness, and other problems that we see, and are more than willing to stand up for, and sometimes getting beat up and arrested by the police for doing so. Now, Jerry, you should give a statement, because Jerry has been one of the main figures around all the concerts.
One question. Where are the cameras here?
Well, you've got to ask them. I'm sure they're here.
I'm sure they're here, yes.
This is Jerry the Peddler. He's one of the main organizers of the concerts at the park. He can tell you a little bit about his problems getting permits.
It's kind of been my responsibility since like 1996 to put together. It's been my responsibility since 1996 to put together these shows. We've continued to speak out about homelessness, about hunger. Nowadays we speak out against the war. We continue to have like punk rock shows. We try to keep this a countercultural event. Practically since the days of the riots, we've had no problems except one little problem 4 years ago. At a concert we billed as the post-election rejection, which was right after both George Bush was elected. The Parks Department has denied us rain dates. They've tried to cut our music back to 3 hours from 4 hours, while they give Charlie Parker, Howell, and everybody else anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. Last year they just out and out denied the permit. Their excuse is the noise. One of their excuses is the noise. My thing is, let's rebuild the band shell. Okay? If the band shell is facing the park and not towards 7th Street, 7th Street isn't going to be bothered anymore. Okay? When the city bulldozed the band shell in the first place, they promised everybody that people in the neighborhood can use this free city stage. Well, ain't nobody got a free stage lately. Okay, they started out charging us $350, then it went up to like $750. Okay, if they would provide us with the stage, again, the sound would be amplified into the park and away from the thing. It stated in the paper today that in the Villager that people around the park write and complain. The people who complain always write. People who don't have any complaints, which is the majority of the people, don't write letters. Okay?
Nobody's even seen the letters. He just said there were letters. So
I'm sure. You know, so it's always a good excuse. Anyway, like I say, last year, at the last minute, we did a show in Washington Square on the 19th anniversary. This year, if they don't give us the permit, then we're going to call for people to come to the park anyway. Okay, we'll do acoustic, we'll do something, but we are going to do something on the 20th anniversary of the Tompkins Square police riot. And it was a police riot. It wasn't. There were riots later where, yeah, maybe it was us and maybe it was them, but that night it was definitely them. This was a situation where hundreds of cops just came marching through the neighborhood, beating anybody and everybody at random. They brought in horses, they brought in motor scooters, they had helicopters circling over the rooftops, and you know, we've just kind of, it brought a lot of diverse areas of the community together for the first time, and many of us have continued to work together since that day, and
Like I say, we're going to be in Tompkins Square on the anniversary of the Tompkins Square riot. Thank you.
So we're privileged to have someone whose videotape turned what was first called a neighborhood riot into a police riot. Clayton Patterson. Clayton, come up and tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Yeah, well, it's definitely changed a lot, and it was qualified as a police riot, really basically because of this 3-hour and 33-minute tape. And what it was is you can see that at that time, the police were basically the anarchists, and there was no structure, there was no chain of command, and it was really obvious in the video. And actually, if you look back now at the video, it's really clear about how out of control the police were. And it was after that that they used the Lower East Side as a training place, and it took them about 4 years really in order to get the police into a paramilitary model. It was actually Tompkins who really doesn't get credit for very much, but he did two major things. He changed the philosophy of the police department into a paramilitary organization, which it did become. And then he created the Mullen Commission. So at that time, there was a real relationship between the cops and the drugs in the neighborhood. And actually, during the Mullen Commission, the 9th Precinct, which is where Tompkins Square Park is, has its own chapter in the Mullen Commission. And, they were dealing drugs, they were collecting money from drug dealers. And it's interesting because it always gets blamed on the people, but in reality, it wasn't the people. It was like John was talking about before, about the need to keep control and watch and think about the politicians. And it's easy to sort of always throw it on the people and say, well, the people are wrong. And in reality, it wasn't. And there were several riots after that went on for a multitude of years. Actually, went on until about 1992. And then what it was really about, and we thought, well, you get rid of the drug dealers, it's great, now the neighborhood's going to be clean. But in reality, all it was really about was gentrifying the neighborhood. And there's been this continual changing and gentrification of the neighborhood, so now it's at a point where most of the neighborhood people are no longer there. I've taken like hundreds of thousands of pictures down there, and if you go through the photographs, because every day always seems the same and you don't really notice, but when you go through the photographs and you look and then you remember the people, all of a sudden you realize it's about 3/4 of the neighborhood has changed and is gone. I used to be able to stand on 7th and A, as all of us here that are familiar with that area could, and we would know a multitude of people. I can stand there now for 20 minutes and know 3 people. So that's how much the neighborhood has changed. And it's really a class war because it's all kind of couched and smoothed over in this really sort of nice look, but in reality it's like NYU is moving in, putting in these these dorms, and we're losing our neighborhood. We're losing New York, really. Everything that was before will never be again. And a big part of what the struggle was around Tompkins Square Park was for rent and for housing. And what happened is that this is the first time that money's overcome poverty. Like in the Lower East Side, you used to have situations where, 1929 would come, the crash would come. Like if you go into Avenue A in 1927, there was this Agaloff Towers. That was kind of like one of those other points of gentrification. They had this beautiful building. And then 1929 came, and then the crash came, and then the Depression came, and then the war came. And then by the time you got into the 50s and after the war, you started this rebuilding. And then you got into the 60s, and then you started getting the fires, and then you got this whole sort of abandonment of the neighborhood. And by 1979, the beginning of Koch, that was when New York City had basically reached the bottom. And from that time forward, they have been sort of cleansing and cleaning up the neighborhood. There's been other things, like actually there was a conspiracy that was, everybody used to talk about around the park, about spatial deconcentration, that was about chasing the people out of the inner cities and getting rid of them. Well, it turns out that word actually did exist and showed up in the Nixon administration. And then by the time you get into the 70s, you start getting into planned shrinkage, and planned shrinkage was about taking out the services. So you got rid of the cops, you got rid of the fire department, then they just let it burn. So what happened then, by the time you get to 1988, you just had these cops who were out of control. They had no really structure. They were like anarchists. So they reformed the police department, you reform the police department, now you got control of the streets. Giuliani comes in, and then they just clean the streets. They get rid of the people on the corners. It doesn't matter if you're a drug dealer, you're standing there, or who you are. And it all seemed great for a while, except that there's nobody there anymore. And when I say everything that was before will never be again, what I'm referring to is that all the greatness that New York stood for, like for example, art, all the culture, Jackson Pollock, Charlie Parker, all of those people were all connected to cheap rent. So what's happened now is that we've killed the culture of New York, and the goose is dead. The muse is no longer here. So even though the city might look better, there's going to be no culture, because all of that culture was connected to cheap rent. CBGBs, we like to talk about CBGBs, and the mayor wants to save that. Well, it isn't going to be possible for musicians to be here any longer.
It's a city bank, right?
It's a city bank. So all of those opportunities and everything that New York and America it was known for was all basically connected to cheap rent and a cheap economy. You used to be able to have like a 99-cent breakfast, 2 eggs, toast, coffee, pan fries, and orange juice. Well, if you're an artist or something, you can survive that way. But you can no longer survive that way, because now it's called brunch and it's $9. And then, you want to go out for a beer. You can't do that anymore, because it's like, it's $100 a night. So who in the neighborhood, especially working at these jobs, and what jobs could people have that can pay, in the corner across from Katz's now, Ludlow Street was, you read about Lou Reed growing up, living on Ludlow Street, rent was $36 a month. That building across from Katz's now, a studio apartment, is $3,000. Well, what artist coming to the city can live there for $3,000? And so what we have is our form of entertainment. Before, as an artist, you had your 99-cent breakfast, but you also had a lot of opportunities and free concerts and things like that. Well, all of that's gone now. And so part of the only free entertainment that we have in the Lower East Side, like Jerry mentions punk band. Well, punk's what CBGB's was all about. The mayor wants to save CBGB's. Well, they can't play in the park anymore. So where are people supposed to go for their entertainment? Because that was free entertainment. So you no longer have an opportunity to go for free entertainment. So now you got to go to a place and pay $40, like, or 20 bucks at Irving Plaza. So there's no opportunities anymore. What about the youth of today? There's nowhere for them to go. Even like with these Tribeca film festivals and things, it's supposed to be about independent films, homegrown films. Well, now it's about Spider-Man and Hollywood. So there's really nothing anymore for the people in New York. So it's become really a class war. And the class war in Manhattan now is, you're going to have to be earning $100,000 at least a year or more. Let's say you go to Columbia School of Journalism and you get a degree in journalism. Well, how do you start off in journalism? You start off with a paper like The Villager. You work for The Villager and you get $50 a story. Well, at $50 a story, how are you going to pay that $3 grand for that apartment? You're not going to be able to do it. So even coming from Columbia, or the New York Times. The New York Times doesn't pay you $300 a story if you're a stringer. They pay you like $200.
I just want to point out that our friend who does regular coverage of our neighborhood and all over the city can't even get hired, even though he's been working for 5 years.
He's done about 800
for the New York Times
now,
because they have a hiring freeze on, and he's making basically just above minimum wage, even though his stories are appearing on the front page of the Metro section almost every day of the week.
So it's not really about even working for the New York Times. You can't survive here being anybody. I mean, I'm sure with the radio people starting off, you don't get $500 a day, and then after then you can pay your $3,000 a month rent. It's not possible. So all we really have is for the people. Imagine kids growing up in New York now. There's nothing. So there was a concert in the park, and it was free, and everybody went there. And Jerry was right. There weren't problems. And so, kids could go there, they do their thing, and that's it. And Jerry's right about the band shell. We should have a band shell. What is there for people now? Everything is about money. Money, money, money. Bloomberg, his whole consciousness is about money. He wants to punish people. It's money. You get fines. Everything now is a fine. If you're a kid going to school, you get rewarded, he's going to give you money. Everything is money. There's more in life than just money. But the whole consciousness of this city is turned into only money. New York used to be special. New York used to represent something. You go through like our neighborhood now, and it's filled with these international corporate stores. You got Starbucks and Kmart, and pretty soon we'll have a Walmart. So that's not about indigenous and homegrown people. That's not about an opportunity. In the mid-'80s, I was able to start this whole baseball thing because it was possible. There was a little guy in Avenue A that made baseballs, and he did embroidery. I said, well, you could put the two together, and he did, and we made a baseball cap. You can't do that anymore because they're exporting all of those kind of jobs. We're worried about the Mexicans coming across the border. I don't care about the Mexicans coming across the border. They're not stealing anybody's job here. The jobs that we're losing, that I'm worried about, are the ones that are going across the ocean. If you're here now and you've got, your x-rays can be read in India. So it's not just like, the guy washing the dishes and that's losing the jobs. It's also like the x-ray technician. You call up and you talk to the bank. You start talking to the bank for a while and you say, oh, what time is it? All of a sudden you find out the person's in India. So we're exporting all of these jobs, and then the dollar's going down. So now we're in this situation where, you're not making any money. Everything is more expensive. and the dollar's gone down, and now we're importing from China. Now China gets expensive because the dollar's worth nothing. I don't think the price of oil is probably that high. It wouldn't be that high if you're in Europe. It's that the dollar is that low. So we got into this insane position where unless you're rich, you can't be here. You know, and even like with this China thing, dog food, toothpaste, just almost anything you can think about. Let's put the people here back to work. Let's build things back for the people. Let's build a band shell in the park for the people. Let's give something to the people. Let's give something to us.
How about a permit? Just a permit to do a
starting off with
concert.
a permit. And so that this, like John was saying and Jerry was saying, this was a tradition in the neighborhood. That collective spirit would allow people to meet in the park and share sort of their creativity and their friendship and their fellowship, and people could get along. You can't even do that now for free. And so they're eliminating everything. They want to have cameras in the park. Well, who are they having cameras in the park for? They're not doing it for me. They're not doing it for us. They're doing it because eventually it's going to be like Washington Square Park, where it's going to be so cleaned up that the only people that are allowed in there or can be there are people that are well off and rich.
It's going to be gated.
And the whole, possibly gated. So everything that we're dealing with, we're losing for people. And it's not just a bunch of anarchists on the Lower East Side complaining about this. This is the whole economy. This is the whole culture. This is all of us.
Can I make a point about that?
You can take over.
I just want to make one point now.
Is that all right?
We're known as the neighborhood troublemakers, but I want to point out, and Lincoln will confirm it, that when the murder happened at the Key Food Store on Avenue A, it was people from our group that called and contacted America's Most Wanted. That we were the first ones to call America's Most Wanted and ask them to run a segment on the Key Food murder so that the guy Gonzalez would get caught. Now, not that we're wanting credit for it or anything else, we just want to point out that we look out for our community, and that's why we called America's Most Wanted. And I had Lincoln call America's Most Wanted from the Villager in another way of pushing them. As soon as America's Most Wanted ran that feature on Gonzalez, 2 days later he was caught in a shelter down in Miami. So we can't be put into the category of all troublemaking neighborhood people, when in fact we are the ones responsible for getting that guy on America's Most Wanted and getting him caught. Although nobody will acknowledge it and nobody will give us credit for it, believe me, you can ask Lincoln here who called him and said people from the neighborhood are calling America's Most Wanted and you should call America's Most Wanted, which he did. And that pushed them to do that segment, and that caused the guy to get caught. So don't put us in the category of just all troublemaking community people.
Actually, I want to add to that in terms of cameras and police surveillance and all the rest of it. It's actually a very interesting point. First of all, I'd like to credit John with all of that whole thing with America's Most Wanted, because there's no question that John did it. He's the guy that pulled that whole thing off, and it took a lot of persistence, because if you think about it, there's murders every day in every city all over the country, and they only put a few on there. So that was really John's persistence. But the interesting thing is I was there and I photographed right after that murder happened, and this is really the interesting point, is that, and it's all about police command and structure. Apparently, because I talked to a person from the Times, I wonder where are the cops? It turned out after that there was some kind of accident on Delancey Street, so all the cops went there. I walked from Houston to 4th Street. By the time I got there, because I saw the ambulances, there were no police there yet. There were no police really showed up at that murder. Normally what would happen, I've been to a lot of incidents, all of a sudden you get 500 cops show up. You know, if the cops had shown up, I don't know why they didn't, but if they had shown up, they would have stopped the trains, they would have blanketed the neighborhood, and they would have caught the guy there. They had a picture of what the guy looked like because he worked there, and they also had a description of him wearing this Canada Dry jacket. So for whatever reason, the cops just didn't show up. And so it's not just about cameras, it's also about people being on point. And it was just rather interesting. It was about 20 minutes or so before there was really a police presence there. And they really could have caught the guy. And it's kind of so you have to ask the question, what happened to the chain of command? What happened to the police communications on that day? You know, we see them all the time, 40 cops, 20 cops driving around, going on all these routines. Well, this was a real thing. It was a murder. And another woman was stabbed. You know, there's one other point that I'd like to make with this too, and that was the woman. There was a woman there that helped the woman that was murdered. There were two of them up in this small space, and her friend really worked. Almost got killed trying to save her friend. There's no acknowledgement for that woman either. That woman should be up here in City Hall and getting some sort of merit award, as the highest award that the city has to offer. That woman almost gave her life. You know, she was slashed in the face, she was stabbed in the side. I mean, it was brutal, and she got nothing out of it. and she really should get recognized. So this recognition factor, it all sort of plays as a PR thing, but there's no real reality to it. Let's get back to the people. Let's get back to us.
This whole thing is a fear thing. We got cameras and everything up to Brazil. We got rules against feeding the pigeons, the squirrels, no dogs off the leash. It's fear. And they want to photograph the cars. You can't even go to the bathroom anymore without getting photographed.
Was that Bill Weinberg who was speaking,
There's
giving the history of the park?
free.
Yes.
And unless we have freedom, yeah, what do you got, right?
One point that has to be, one point that has to be made is
Who are you?
that my name is Carl Rosenstein, and it's very important that, you know, back in the 60s and up until about 10, 15 years, about 10, 12 years ago, we had the Fillmore in the 60s. We had the electric circus. We had all kinds of hangouts and coffee houses, and we had Tompkins Square Park, as Clayton has pointed out, was the center, organizing center for labor protests, for countercultural activities, and this is why we have to make. This is why we need the park. We need the park as an organizing center against the war in Iraq, against the war in Afghanistan, against the pending war in Iran, and possibly Pakistan, and possibly Venezuela. We're going to need the park as an organizing center because we once had the squats. The squats are going legal, so all we really have left is the park. We're going to need a gathering place for people, working people, for young people to come together to talk about the situation, about the war, organize against military recruiters in the high schools, colleges, how to keep them out, how to organize against the war, and how to organize to deal with the economy. We need the park, and this is why it's so important that the park be kept open, be made a focal point and a center for activity, and it's a center for the neighborhood. And so, you know, that's it. We need it.
What was your last name?
Carl, with a K.
What's your last
Rosenstein.
Thank you.
All right.